So if you're like me, you've probably always had an image that comes to mind when you think of New York style pizza, but what actually defines a proper New York slice? Well, depending on who you ask, you may get different answers, but the large thin crust slices that we're all familiar with actually stemmed from the Neapolitan style pizza. Because when Italian immigrants in New York City opened the country's first pizza shops, that's basically what they were selling. But over time, the pizza evolved to better suit its environment as pizzerias started using things like low moisture mozzarella cheese and canned tomatoes, and started selling pizza by the slice to accommodate the lifestyles of busy New Yorkers. So today, New York style pizza is defined by those slices, which are made up of a chewy, crisp crust, a sweet and tangy sauce with just a few herbs added, and a cheese that's gooey, stretchy, and usually a little bit greasy. And as Ken Forkish describes in his book, The Elements of Pizza, the ideal New York slice should be just sturdy enough to maintain a bit of tip sag so as to make the slice easily foldable. So I like to learn from books whenever possible, and this is one that I've actually been wanting for quite a while now, so I figured it was the perfect excuse to get it. You see, the 4 basic ingredients that all doughs need are flour, water, salt, and yeast. And a ton of breads and pizzas are made using just those 4 ingredients. But when it comes to a New York style pizza dough, it typically includes 2 more additions: sugar and olive oil. Sugar to help the crust brown evenly all over, and olive oil to provide tenderness to the dough so that it ends up crispy without being overly chewy. But Ken's dough just includes the 4 basic ingredients, so I'm very curious to see how that'll work as a New York pizza. Alright, so in addition to Ken's recipe from the book, I wanted to go with a couple other recipes that were a bit more, I guess, traditional for a New York style pizza, meaning that they also include olive oil and sugar. So the first is going to be Kenji Lopez Alt's recipe from SeriesEats.com, and the next was from YouTube's New York style pizza legend himself, Adam Ragusea. Now both of these recipes contain the same basic ingredients, it's really just the ratios that are different. So it doesn't really make sense for me to try to make a recipe from scratch. I mean, these ones are already battle tested, and between the 2 more traditional recipes, plus the more bare bones recipe from the book, I should have all of my bases covered. So to make the dough, I'm following a very simple process, which I'm keeping the same for all 3 recipes. I'm simply mixing all of the ingredients in a bowl, using my dough whisk to bring them together. And by the way, I'm using bread flour here just to give the dough that little bit of extra structure that we're looking for a New York style pizza. Then I'll knead each dough by hand until they develop some decent stretch, which will take about 5 minutes each. They don't need to be perfectly smooth and extensible yet, because I'm going to be using a very long fermentation period, which will give the dough plenty of time to develop gluten. So after the kneading, I'll just let each dough rise in an oiled container for 1 to 2 hours until about doubled in size. Then I'll cut off a small piece of each one to use for testing purposes before tossing all of the containers into the fridge for the long cold fermentation period. Alright, so it's been about 3 days since I put these doughs in the fridge, and it's time for the taste test. First thing I noticed is that the amount the doughs rose seems to be proportional to the amount of sugar that was in them. For example, this one had the most sugar, this one had no sugar, and then this was somewhere in the middle. And in terms of the smell, the sugar seems to be affecting that as well. So Kenji's dough has by far the most sort of fermenty, alcohol-y aroma, whereas Ken's dough is much more sort of mild and sweet smelling. So what I'm gonna do here is just coat them with a bit of uncooked tomato sauce, because really I'm just trying to judge the crust. So I don't care too much about perfecting the rest of the pizza quite yet. You know, I could test just the dough itself, but I feel like I'm not really gonna get the full effect unless I have some sauce and cheese on there. Normally I like to stretch them out a bit more, but it's proving to be a little difficult with these tiny pizzas, so we'll just slide them off into the oven like this. Alright, so I'm basically looking for a few things here. Number 1, I'm gonna test the crispiness. Number 2, the chewiness. And of course, number 3 is gonna be the flavor. In a good New York pizza, it should have a little bit of crisp and crackle to it, but it shouldn't be crunchy or brittle. So before the taste test, I don't really notice any major differences between the 3. They all have some pretty nice charring on the bottom without being too burnt. Crispiness seems pretty similar. If anything, the Adam Ragusea dough is slightly less crispy than the other 2, but ultimately, it's all gonna come down to flavor. Immediately, I do prefer the texture of the Kenji dough. I think due to the addition of the olive oil, it makes the dough just a little bit more tender. This one's a little bit chewier, reminding me a little bit more of a Neapolitan style pizza, which makes sense given that the dough is essentially the same. So overall, I definitely think these 2 doughs, which had olive oil and sugar added, fit the bill a little bit better for a New York style pizza. This one's definitely a great dough, but again, I think it's just a little bit too chewy and bready for this type of pizza. Now, it's pretty hard to discern between each of these 2, so I'll probably save my official judgment until I bake the entire pies. But just off of first impression, I do think I like the Kenji dough the best, just because it does have a little bit of a nicer crunch to it. Not to mention, the dough is a little bit easier to handle due to the lower hydration, so that's a nice bonus. One thing I am noticing is I'm getting a little bit of cheese separation, meaning that the cheese is getting too hot before the crust really gets fully browned. So that's something I'll need to work out, but I'll deal with that one later. For now, let's compare these two crusts. Pretty decent foldability. Not as crispy as I would like. Again, pretty solid crust on the bottom. This one seems to have a little better crispiness to it.
So in terms of flavor, the two doughs are pretty much exactly the same. But because Kenji's dough is a bit crispier and more structured, I think it's the best representation of the true New York style. And so from this point forward, that's the recipe I'll be using. But there is still one more thing I want to test.
Alright, so this right here is known as a biga, and it's basically just a mixture of flour, water, and yeast, which I've left out to rise for about 12 hours. So it's similar to a sourdough starter in the sense that you can add it to any dough to serve as a source of leavening and to add some extra complexity and flavor to the bread. The difference, of course, is just that this is made using commercial yeast, where a sourdough starter is made using naturally cultivated yeast. Allegedly, it also helps improve the texture of the dough, but I'll be the judge of that. So the first thing I noticed is that the version with the biga definitely has a much stronger smell. A little more fermenty, alcoholic, and tangy. I also noticed as I was shaping the doughs, the biga dough seemed to be a lot easier to handle despite them being the same hydration. So I could see the biga being a good way to sort of work with higher hydration doughs without making them harder to handle. But of course, what I really care about is what they taste like when they're baked. All right, biga, no biga. Again, I am getting a bit of separation here between the fat and the cheese. So that's something I definitely need to fix. But for now, let's focus on the crust. Looking at the bottoms of the pizza, they both look pretty much exactly the same. A little bit of charring, but not too brown. I'd say that's just about perfect. Crispiness test. Seems like the no biga version had just a little bit more crispiness to it, but let's give them a taste and see what we think. It is hot, that's for sure. Very interesting. So the biga definitely adds some more complexity of flavor to the dough. I mean, it almost makes it more sourdough-like. But this is what I didn't really expect. I actually think I prefer just the straight dough. I think for this New York slice, it's all about simplicity. And the fact that this dough is already fermented for between 48 to 72 hours, I think that gives it plenty of flavor. But for some reason, I just don't think this is quite it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is good pizza, but I just don't know if it's hitting the mark on that classic New York slice. But hold on. Let me try one more thing. Not this. This is what we need to do. So one of the defining characteristics of a New York pizza is that slight tip sag you get when you lift up the slice.
This is an example of a pizza that does not suffer from extreme tip sag. It's still crisp on the bottom. The cheese isn't coming off. Even though it dips, it's not completely flaccid.
But when you're cooking in a home oven, you usually don't end up with slices big enough to get a true, accurate judgment of that. So what I've done, I've cut myself a nice big slice so I can give it a try. Look at that. We're talking 90-degree angle right there. It's not what we want. It's not it. So what's the problem? I mean, is it the hydration? I don't think so. It had plenty of oil in the recipe. I don't think it's the olive oil. The sugar shouldn't have any impact. I got it. Let's go back to the drawing board. New York style pizza, Neapolitan. All right, check this out. New York style, Neapolitan. I think I know what we need to do. Neapolitan, New York. You see, up until this point, I think my pizza resembles more of a Neapolitan style than a New York style. So the Neapolitan is lighter in color with just a few charred bits. It has a very soft and chewy crust with only a little bit of crunch to it. It's not meant to be sliced and held in your hand. Oftentimes, Neapolitan style pizzas are eaten with a fork and knife. Whereas with the New York style, the crust isn't quite as light and airy, and it's more evenly browned all over with only a little bit of charring. And on top of that, the crust isn't quite as chewy, but it's significantly crisper. It shouldn't be hard hard or crunchy, but it should have a little bit of crispness to it, and it should be structured enough to at least relatively support its own weight. Of course, it's gonna sag a little bit. I mean, that's why the classic way to eat a New York slice is to fold it in half, but it shouldn't completely flop over like what we were seeing with my slices. So that's what we need. And there are basically two ways that we can achieve that. The first is switching the ingredients, but like I already mentioned, I don't think I want to switch up the recipe. You see, there are primarily two ingredients that affect these aspects of the dough: the olive oil and the sugar. The olive oil contributing to the tenderness of the dough, and the sugar contributing to the more even browning. However, the recipes that I'm using are tried and true recipes, so I think it's unlikely that I'd really be able to improve upon them significantly. Instead, we're gonna go with the second way, which is to change our cooking method. So I thought I could just worry about the cooking method at the end, but that really doesn't make any sense. I mean, baking isn't an afterthought. It's the very foundation of this dish. It's what makes a pizza a pizza. So here's the plan. In my oven, I have 3 possible rack positions. The top rack is typically used for a Neapolitan style pizza, because with that style of pizza, you want your oven to be as hot as possible. In my case, the highest my oven goes is 550 degrees, but professional pizza ovens get up to about 1,000 degrees. So up until this point, that's what I've been doing. I'm throwing my pizza stone on the top rack, cranking the oven as high as it can go, and then once I throw the pizza in, it only takes like 4 or 5 minutes to bake. But New York style pizzas are typically baked for longer than that, sometimes up to 12 or 15 minutes, which means clearly I'm doing something wrong. So the plan is to move my pizza steel down to the second rack of my oven, and I'm gonna turn the temperature down to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And since the oven temperature is lower overall, I shouldn't be getting those charred bits like you see on a Neapolitan style pizza. The crust should instead be more evenly browned all throughout. All right, here we go. We're gonna reverse engineer this baby, and this time we're gonna do it right. Let's go.
C'è la luna in mezzo mare, mamma mia, mamma di dare. Figli mie, cutte dare, mamma mia, pensaci tu.
But before we move on to the next episode, I have a question for you. Do you ever struggle to handle your pizza dough? Maybe it sticks to your hands or your peel, maybe it tears when you try to stretch it, or maybe it just won't stretch out no matter how hard you try. If you're like I used to be, you probably deal with those issues nearly every time you make pizza. And while I may have been making some okay pies, they just didn't remind me of what I could get at my favorite pizzerias. That is until I learned the tricks and techniques that the pros use. Really, it wasn't until I started working at a pizzeria myself that I learned most of these things. But now that I want to share these secrets with you so that you can get results like this and this and this. Which is why I've recently launched my 120-minute workshop that'll help you to discover the dough handling secrets to make perfect pizza every single time. In the workshop, you can follow along as we make, shape, and stretch pizza dough together, and we'll walk through everything you need to know to make sure that your next pizza and your next is always better than the last. And for viewers of this video, I'm offering an exclusive discount, so just enter the code NYPizza10 at checkout to get 10% off. Now, let's get back to the video. This is a proper New York slice. And after studying some of the top pizza shops in New York, I found a few secrets that I think are gonna help me make it at home. Wow, that is by far the best slice we've made yet. So this is episode 2 of my New York pizza series, where the goal is to recreate the perfect, authentic New York slice at home. And where we left off last time, I had tested 3 popular New York style pizza recipes, but none of them gave me exactly what I was looking for. Look at that. It's not it. But then I had an idea. We need a crisper, more evenly browned, and sturdier crust. So the plan is to move my pizza steel down to the second rack of my oven, and I'm gonna turn the temperature down to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So that pizza was better, but it still wasn't quite there. And honestly, I was starting to get a little discouraged. But then I realized something else, largely thanks to a comment on last week's video that would completely change the course of this challenge. You see, the recipes I've been using have called for a pretty high hydration, much higher than is typical for a New York pizza shop. And the reasoning was that since we're baking in a lower temperature oven at home, we need to bake the pizza for longer, and therefore more of the water in the dough is gonna evaporate. Which is of course true, but I think they actually overcompensated for that effect when they were developing the recipes. I mean, in Kenji's recipe, he went a full 10% higher than most New York pizza shops. And Adam Ragusa went even higher. In fact, in his video, he said this.
I really prefer wetter doughs these days. They bake up lighter and crispier.
But that's a bit misleading, and honestly, it kind of led me down the wrong path for a while. So here's what actually happens when we increase the hydration in our dough. We know that as a dough rises during fermentation, what it's really doing is filling up with a bunch of tiny little gas bubbles, specifically bubbles containing carbon dioxide and water vapor. So once the dough starts to bake, those gases rapidly heat up and expand. And at the same time, even more gas is being produced due to the evaporation of the water in the dough. And you can imagine that the more water you use, the more gas is produced, and the bigger those bubbles can get. So that's why Adam says that higher hydration doughs bake up lighter, but why crispier? Well, we can see that since the higher hydration dough forms bigger bubbles, the borders of those bubbles will be stretched thinner. So the exteriors of the bubbles will get very crispy because the water can evaporate off of that thin dough very quickly. But again, those are just a few bits on the exterior of the dough. It still contains more water overall. Therefore, the overall structure of the dough ends up a little bit floppier and chewier rather than the crispy and slightly rigid structure that we want. So with this knowledge, I came into the challenge with a renewed sense of direction. I took my Kenji recipe, which originally called for around 67% hydration, and reduced it all the way down to 60%. All right. That is what we're looking for. This is definitely the best slice we've made yet. It's got a little bit more structure to it. It is a little chewier than I would like and not quite crispy enough. It is getting closer though. But the sort of realization has led me to question my method as a whole. I mean, if I have to modify these recipes so heavily just to create something slightly resembling a New York style pizza, are they even the right recipes to begin with? If authenticity is what I'm chasing, I shouldn't start with recipes designed for home cooks. What I need to do is study the pros, the people who have mastered this style of pizza. That is, New York pizza shops. I'm not going to New York though, as much as I would like to. I did actually go a few weeks ago though, and I had the opportunity to try one of the most iconic slice shops in the city. And I recently found out that that same iconic shop opened up a satellite location in my old college town. All right, here we are. There it is. I'm just kidding. Let's keep it moving. So first impressions of the slice, it's very thin, but it's got that perfect, crisp, relatively sturdy crust that I've been looking for. Tip sag test, it's not nearly a 90-degree angle like I was seeing with my pizza, and if you just give it a little crease right here, it stands perfectly sturdy. Really nice browning on the cheese here without being too greasy. Bottom is really nicely charred as well. I don't think I could wait any longer. Let's give it a try. So we'll just talk about the crust first because that's what we're focusing on in this episode. But really, this is exactly the crust I've been trying to achieve. I mean, the visuals tell pretty much the whole story. Again, it's nice and sturdy, but it's still got a little bit of chew to it. And it's also got a really nice crunch when you bite into it. Again, it's a really thin crust, but it does have a good bit of airiness to it. Nothing crazy though. Flavor-wise, the crust does leave a little something to be desired. I think maybe it could use a little bit more salt, but texture-wise, it's 100% spot on. Now, in terms of the cheese, again, it's not too greasy, so I think they really nail the cooking temperature there. I think it could have a little bit more flavor. If I had to guess, honestly, I don't think that they're using a full-fat cheese. It does get a little rubbery after it cools down, but I mean, that's pretty hard to avoid with any cheese. The two main traits I would use to describe the sauce would be sweet and tangy. Personally, I think I like a little less sweet than this, so I think that's something we're gonna work on improving with our own recipe. All right, well, I think we got what we need, so it's time to head back to the lab and work on this recipe. So I think Joe's is a great embodiment of the New York slice that I'm going for, but it does definitely have its flaws, namely the flavor and seemingly the quality of ingredients as well. But that's where our next shop comes in. It's one that makes it a point to maintain the tradition of the New York slice, but that also tries to improve upon it, primarily by using higher quality ingredients.
Try to serve what the people want, like a good version of a New York style. And the beauty of it's not bad for you.
So Scars is quickly becoming known as one of the best slices in New York. Unfortunately though, I haven't actually had the chance to try it myself. That's okay though. I think that with the help of the internet, we can gain a lot of insight into how and why this pizza is so great. Now again, there are aspects of both shops that I think I want to replicate. For Joe's, it's mainly the texture of the crust, which is going to come from the dough recipe and from the baking method. And then for pretty much every other aspect of the pizza, I'm going to look to Scars. But since the crust is what we're focused on right now, let's start with Joe's Pizza recipe NYC. I would imagine there's a lot of Joe's Pizza out there, so I should probably specify New York. Got a few promising links here. Yeah, that's not right. Next, this one claims that Joe's revealed the secret to the recipe, but nowhere in the actual article does it say that it is Joe's recipe. So next, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for. All right, we struck gold, folks. I found this forum, pizzamaking.com. Basically, you know, people can go and ask questions about pizza making, as you might imagine. And someone was asking for Joe's recipe. So this guy who used to work for Joe's entered the chat, and basically the rest is history. I mean, he gave us the entire recipe, everything from the dough to the sauce to the cheese. So honestly, I think we got what we need here. It ended up being a lot easier than I thought it would be. Now, let's see what we can find out about Scars, pizza, recipe, NYC. So this one definitely isn't gonna be as straightforward as Joe. It seems like the owner, Scar here, he keeps his recipe pretty under wraps. But there is one thing that I knew going into this, and it's the thing that most people point out when they mention Scars.
And we also mill our own flour as well.
And so you're milling from grains like this?
Correct.
These are wheat berries?
Yeah. These are orange white wheat. We try to replicate New York style pizza without using what 90-something% of New York style pizzas are, like, you know, chemically laced flours and stuff. We don't use any of that.
So on this pizza making forum, people are speculating about the recipe and they're trying out different formulations, so that'll definitely give me a good place to start. But on top of that, there are a few pretty good videos that we can get some clues from.
A mix of high protein and low protein flours.
So you're starting on low just to get everything incorporated?
Yeah, we add salt. The olive oil, super soft.
Right.
You get one rise when you're boiling, slower rise when it's in the fridge. Then you get the last rise when you pull them out and we allow it to rise all day. The day of use, basically. The day of use.
Yeah, this shot gives us a really good idea for the texture of the dough. It definitely looks very similar to Joe's in terms of the structure. So these videos pretty much give me all the ingredients that are included in the dough, and they give me a good idea for sort of how the dough should look and feel throughout the process. A few things we don't know is number one, how much freshly milled flour he uses, and he also uses a bit more salt and a slightly higher hydration, which makes sense because that freshly milled flour is going to be a little bit more absorbent than a typical white flour would be. So with my newfound knowledge and experiences, I developed 3 new recipes, each one aimed at testing a different variable. So recipe number 1 is what I'm calling my Joe's dough. As we learned, Joe's uses a hydration of 57% and they bake their pizza at 625 degrees Fahrenheit. So what I've got here is a 60% hydration dough because again, since I can only bake at 550 degrees Fahrenheit, I do think we need to add a little bit of extra water to account for that. Just not as much as Ken, Kenji, or Adam used in their recipes. And by the way, for all of these recipes, I'm using bread flour because that's generally the highest protein flour that anyone's gonna be able to find at their local grocery store. All right, time for the moment of truth. Look at that. That's like Joe's. That's like Joe's right there. I mean, it's got that same crackle. That is a good slice of pizza right there. I would say it could be a little bit crispier. That's my only critique. But let's see how it tastes. Wow. This is by far the best slice we've made yet. Way better than any of the recipes we tested in the last episode. I think we're on the right track here. Now recipe number 2 is sort of an attempt to improve the basic Joe's recipe. Because if you remember, I did find the Joe's dough to be a bit bland in flavor. So what I did here was bump the salt content from 2.7 up to 3.2%. And I also used a bit more olive oil than I did in the first recipe. I also bumped the hydration up to 62%, which is still significantly lower than the 67% from Kenji's recipe. But I just wanted to see what effect using sort of a mid-level hydration would have. So this is still a super solid slice. The one problem is I did need to bake it a little bit longer to get it to the same level of crispiness as recipe number 1. And even so, I don't think I got it quite as crispy. But really the main testing point for this slice of pizza was the flavor. So it is kind of subtle, but I do think I prefer the higher salt levels in dough number 2. It just really makes those sort of fermenty, bready flavors pop a little bit more. Overall, this slice is a little bit too salty, but I think that I can balance it out more just by using a little less salt in the sauce. Now finally, recipe number 3 is my first attempt at a Scars style dough. So we know that a lot of what makes Scars dough special is his addition of some freshly milled flour. However, I didn't want to do that because it's just not practical for most people, myself included actually. I don't own a flour mill. But what I did do was replace 10% of the bread flour in the recipe with whole wheat flour. So in my mind, that should be a much easier method, one that anyone can follow to incorporate some extra flavor and nutrition into the dough. All right, now this is the one that I'm super curious about because I've never made a pizza with anything but 100% white flour. Maybe not quite as rigid as recipe number 1. I might have actually stretched it a little bit too thin, which really I didn't think that was gonna be a problem because whole wheat flour doesn't develop gluten as well, so I thought the dough might tear if I tried to stretch it out, but that really wasn't an issue at all. So pretty nice crispiness to it. Pretty solid structure as well. I mean, I would say it's on par with the other 2 recipes. Yeah, so the whole wheat flour definitely adds a pretty nice bready, wheaty flavor to it. It is pretty subtle, but given that the flour didn't have any other noticeable negative impacts, I don't see any reason not to include it. Alright, so with all that testing done, it's time to build my ultimate recipe. So we're gonna talk in terms of baker's percentages, just so that the recipe can be scaled however we need it to be. And if you're not familiar with how baker's percentages work, basically the flour is always at 100%, and then the rest of the ingredients are expressed as a percentage of the total flour. So for example, if you have 100 grams of flour and 60 grams of water, that's a 60% hydration. Likewise, 2 grams of salt per 100 grams of flour equates to 2% salt, and so on. Now, like I mentioned, there were aspects of each of these 3 recipes that I liked. But for all 3, I did keep the sugar and the yeast the same. Even though Joe's and Scar's don't seem to use sugar in their dough, I think that since we're baking at a lower temperature in our home oven, the sugar does help the crust to caramelize a little bit better. Now for the yeast, it doesn't really matter how much you use. That's just gonna affect how quickly or how slowly the dough rises. For me though, I like to err on the lower side, just about 0.5%, because the slower the dough rises, the more opportunity it has to develop those nice fermenty, bready flavors. And now for the flour. So again, by default, the baker's percentage is gonna be 100%. But in recipe number 3, 10% of that flour was whole wheat. And that's something that I definitely wanna maintain because it added a nice flavor to the dough. However, I think I do actually wanna bump that up to 15%. Based on my research, Scar's uses somewhere between 10 and 20%. So I figured I might as well split it right down the middle. And in my experience, that increased whole wheat content didn't make the dough any harder to shape. So I might as well push it as high as it can go until I see any negative impacts. Now for the hydration, I definitely like the texture of recipe number 1, so I would go with the hydration of 60%, but since I am using 15% whole wheat flour, which absorbs much more water than bread flour, I'm gonna bump that up to 61%, and that should give me about the same texture that I saw with recipe number 1. Now for the salt, both recipes 2 and 3 use 3.2% salt, and I definitely thought that brought out the flavors of the wheat in the dough a little bit better. Then for olive oil, again, I did like the texture of recipe number 1 the best, so I'm not gonna mess with that. I'm just gonna stick with 3% olive oil. So there we go. I don't think this is gonna be my final recipe, just because I still need to rework the baking process based on some of these other new things that I've learned. But I do think that it gets us most of the way there. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next episode where we're gonna figure out what's the best cheese for a New York slice. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.
So when it comes to New York style pizza, the cheese is one thing that nearly everyone can agree on.
New York, traditionally, you're looking at a low moisture mozzarella.
Rated low moisture mozzarella.
Low moisture mozzarella.
Low moisture mozzarella.
But that still leaves us with a lot of choices to make. So today we're gonna figure out which cheese or combination of cheeses is gonna help us make the best New York slice. Now this is episode 3 of my New York pizza series, where the goal is to recreate a perfect, authentic New York slice at home. And in the first 2 episodes, we tackled the dough, but today is all about the cheese. Now one thing that I definitely know going into this is to avoid pre-shredded cheeses, because they nearly always contain anti-caking agents that mess with the texture of the cheese. So already that narrows down my options quite a bit, but now I have a major decision to make. So here I have 2 different types of low moisture mozzarella from my local grocery store. This one is full fat, otherwise known as whole milk mozzarella, and this one is part skim. And as the names imply, the difference is really just in the fat content. So what does that mean for our pizza? Well, in the same way that whole milk is richer and more flavorful than say 2% milk, the whole milk mozzarella is richer, fattier, and more flavorful than its part skim counterpart. So full fat sounds like the obvious choice, and it's what I've been using in my testing so far. But as I found out the hard way, that higher fat content also leads to one pretty big issue. I'm getting a little bit of cheese separation, meaning that the cheese is getting too hot. Again, I am getting a bit of separation here between the fat and the cheese. So in theory, that greasy fat separation shouldn't be as big of an issue with the part skim mozzarella, simply because it contains less fat to begin with. And based on my research, a lot of pizza shops do use some portion of part skim mozzarella, primarily for that reason. And Joe's Pizza, which I'm using as sort of a guideline for this challenge, is one of those places. For their classic cheese slice, they only use part skim cheese. But of course, by doing that, they are sacrificing some flavor. And when I tasted their pizza, it definitely showed. Now in terms of the cheese, again, it's not too greasy, so I think they really nailed the cooking temperature there. I think it could have a little bit more flavor. If I had to guess, honestly, I don't think that they're using a full fat cheese. It just doesn't really have a ton of flavor to it. In my opinion, the cheese was the weakest part of that pizza. So personally, I don't want to use part skim mozzarella unless I absolutely have to. But I definitely need to change something. So next, I looked to Scar's, which is the other New York pizza shop that I'm using for guidance on this series. And I found that they use a blend of 3 different cheeses. Unfortunately though, they keep that blend a secret. So I guess I'm kind of on my own here, but I think I know where I can start. So whole milk low mozzarella moisture. That's not right. So whole milk, low moisture mozzarella can be pretty hard to find. And actually I looked at 4 local grocery stores and this was the only one that I could find. But looking at other New York pizza videos online, I seem to be having a bigger issue with fat separation than most others. And then I came across something that Adam Ragusa said in his original New York pizza video.
Time to think about cheese, and yes, I use string cheese. It is ridiculous, but where I live, this is the only form in which I can get whole milk, low moisture mozzarella.
So I figured it was worth a try. The original cheese is quite greasy, while the string cheese is a little greasy, but it's more of like an emulsified grease, if that makes sense. So not very ideal. Not ideal at all. And that's what we've been working with up until this point. So the string cheese is definitely better. I mean, sure, quite a bit of the fat was squeezed out, but the remaining cheese has a much nicer, richer texture to it. And you really don't get the full effect just by looking at it. I mean, the minute you taste it, you can tell a massive difference. So sure enough, I was able to confirm that the brand of cheese definitely makes a difference. And I was happy to see that because I mean, these are Kraft cheese sticks, so they should be pretty easy for most people to find. And honestly, if this is all you can find, I think you'll be just fine. But it is kind of a goofy solution. I mean, this isn't Chuck E. Cheese. We're trying to make an authentic New York slice. So I think what we need to do is find out which specific brands of cheese are used by New York pizza shops and see if we can get our hands on some. So there's one brand of low moisture mozzarella that I saw repeatedly mentioned online, and that pretty much seems to be the gold standard for pizza shops. So the brand is called Grande, but unfortunately it's not really easy to get your hands on unless you're a restaurant, which obviously I'm not. However, there is a restaurant supply store near me that sounds like it might have some decent alternatives. So immediately I can see a pretty big difference. I don't know if it really comes across on camera, but with my original cheese and the cheese stick, there's almost like little holes in the cheese where it looks like maybe the grease kind of got squeezed out. Whereas the Gordon Foods cheese doesn't really have that, and it seems to be the least greasy overall as well. So taste-wise, these cheeses are all pretty much exactly the same, but when we look at the texture, that's when things get really interesting. My original 2 cheeses here are a lot more sort of rubbery and stringy, and I think that becomes a lot more evident once the cheese starts to cool down. Biting into the pizzas, those original 2 cheeses have a much chewier, again, sort of rubbery, stringy texture, whereas our Gordon Foods cheese maintained a nicer, creamy and soft texture. So it's become pretty clear that this is gonna be my best option as far as low moisture whole milk mozzarella goes. But I still do wanna try out the part skim. Unfortunately, Gordon Foods also sells one of those, so I'm gonna do just a bit more testing and I'll get back with the result. Actually, first I have one more thing I wanna test. You see, one problem with mozzarella is that it is pretty mild tasting. Even the whole milk version, while it does have a nice sort of buttery richness to it, it doesn't have a lot of that tangy, cheesy flavor. So one way that a lot of New York pizzerias enhance the flavor of their pizza is by adding some grated Parmigiano or Pecorino cheese. And for me, I also picked up some of this Kraft Parmesan for good measure. So you know the drill by now, let's bake some pizza. So honestly, the differences between the 3 are kind of subtle. They all added a noticeable saltiness to the pizza, but I could definitely taste the Parmigiano and the Pecorino a little bit more than the Kraft Parmesan. The Kraft Parmesan pretty much just added saltiness. Overall, I think they all did improve the pizza, but if I were to pick one, I would go with the Pecorino. I think it added just the right amount of saltiness, and I could still taste the nice sort of cheesy, tangy flavors of it. But again, I don't think you could go wrong with the Parmigiano either. I just wouldn't recommend the Kraft Parmesan. One thing I do know though is that I would use a little bit less cheese than I used during this test. But of course, ultimately the amount you use is just gonna come down to personal preference. Now with all that figured out, it's time for our final, most important test. Whole milk mozzarella versus part skim. So I baked one pizza using entirely whole milk cheese and another pizza using a blend of 50-50 whole milk part skim. And honestly, when I pulled the pizzas out of the oven, I thought I had gotten them mixed up. The 50-50 blend seemed just as greasy, if not more than the full fat version. So to fix this mistake, I baked another pizza, this time using entirely part skim cheese. But sure enough, it was just as greasy, and it tasted noticeably worse than the full fat version. So based on my testing, I see no reason to use any part skim cheese. The negative flavor impact is just way too noticeable.
However, after filming the majority of the testing for this video, I did actually get my hands on some Grande cheese at a different Gordon Foods location. I had to drive a long way to get it, but given that this is a cheese that most New York pizzerias use, I don't think this testing would have been complete without it. Granted, it is their East Coast blend, which is a 50-50 mix of whole milk and part skim cheese, just because that was all I could find. But my main takeaway is that while it is a great cheese, probably the best of any of the cheeses I tested, it wasn't by a huge margin, and it didn't significantly change the flavor profile of the pizza. So I'd say that if you can get it, you might as well, but otherwise just try to find the highest quality whole milk, low moisture mozzarella you can, and you should be just fine. You're still gonna be able to achieve that authentic New York style pizza taste. But with that said, one problem I am still having, even with the grande cheese, is that it's ending up a bit greasier than I would like. But I think that's something we can largely fix by again tinkering with our baking method.
And that's exactly what we're gonna do in the next episode, where I'm gonna try to bake my pizza exactly the way that a New York pizza shop does, or at least as close as I can using my home oven. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. So if you've ever made pizza at home, you know that one of the biggest issues is that most home ovens don't get hot enough. But recently I found a trick that might actually solve this issue. So already my oven runs about 20 to 30 degrees hot, which is good, at least when it comes to pizza making. But just by pressing a few buttons, I can actually calibrate it to get 35 degrees hotter. And in my experience, this actually got my oven up to 70 degrees hotter than whatever temperature I have it set to. Now this probe maxes out at 572, which is why I only have my oven set to 500. But based on that, my oven should be able to get all the way up to about 620 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right within that 600 to 625 degree range that we want for a New York style pizza. And this is something that most ovens should be able to do. And actually, I wasn't even aware of it until last week when I saw this comment on my video. So I appreciate that suggestion. But even so, the oven temperature is only one piece of the puzzle. And actually, there's something that's arguably even more important. To achieve a proper crust, you need to bake your pizza on top of something very hot that can retain and transfer heat well. So stone is what most pizza shops use in their oven, but it's not the only option. And in fact, I don't use a stone anymore. Instead, I use a baking steel. It actually works even better than a stone, at least in home ovens where you can't reach professional pizza oven temperatures. But despite what some people may say, a steel doesn't get hotter than a stone. What it does do though is transfer heat much more effectively. So if you think about sticking your hand into a pot of boiling water, we all know that you'd burn yourself instantly. But if you stick your hand into that same temperature air, you'll be just fine. And that's because water transfers heat much more quickly than air, in the same way that steel transfers heat much more quickly than stone. So that's exactly what we want. We want our surface to transfer heat to the bottom of the pizza as quickly as possible to give the bottom crust that nice crispiness and charring. So even though the steel is a bit more expensive, I would highly recommend it. But it actually gets even better, because the other day I was on the Baking Steel website doing some research for this video, and I noticed they had something new called the Baking Steel Pro. Hey look, they have something new called the Baking Steel Pro. Alright, so it's a little thicker than the other one. Big whoop, it's also more expensive. Ah, 16 by 16. All right, I'm sold. All right. So my original baking steel was only 14 by 16, which of course meant that I could only bake 14-inch pizzas. But one of the defining characteristics of a New York style pizza is its size. And even though this won't quite get us to the full 18 to 20-inch pizza, it will get us a lot closer. And just to be clear, this video isn't sponsored. I bought these both with my own money. They're just genuinely great products. I mean, just look at the difference between a pizza baked on a baking tray versus my original baking steel versus the Baking Steel Pro. I didn't even think it'd be that noticeable, but the differences are pretty clear. So with that settled, it's time to make some pizza. As always, starting with the dough. Now, one aspect of the pizza making process that I think is sort of overlooked by a lot of home cooks, myself included until I started this series, is the actual creation of the dough balls. Because it's the first step in creating an even, uniform dough, and it's something that all of my sort of online mentors discuss the importance of.
So I'm creating tension right now.
Right.
And like close it up, because if you don't close it up, what happens is when it starts proofing in there, a gas bubble could form in there. So when you're opening it up, you get thin spot in the middle.
So for the life of me, I cannot figure out this whole closing off the seams thing that they do, but I don't think it really matters. I just shape it the same way that I would any other loaf of bread, by dragging it along the counter to create tension, and it seems to work out just fine. What does matter though is the container that you proof in. I mean, if you start with a dough that isn't uniform, you're never going to be able to stretch it out evenly. So those deli containers I was using before completely mess with the shape of the dough. So most pizza shops use these aluminum tins, but really you can use anything that's wide enough to let the dough expand outward. Personally, I had a couple of these cake pans, which just so happen to be similar in size to the aluminum pizza pans. But again, pretty much anything would work. So this works, this works, this works, this works, even this works. I'm a firm believer that you don't need to buy specialized equipment that only has one specific use in your kitchen.
Now this is my pizza peel, which is a piece of specialized equipment that only has one specific use in my kitchen. I know, nobody's perfect. But there's a reason I bought this. I mean, you may have noticed so far that I haven't even been using a pizza peel in this series. And really, that hasn't caused any issues. But now that I do have this bigger pizza steel that can make 16-inch pizzas, I needed something that could handle that. And the cookie tray that I've been using so far just physically isn't big enough. Plus, the pizza dough does slide off of wood a lot easier than metal, so if you're gonna buy a specialized piece of equipment, a wooden pizza peel is a pretty good one. Anyways, with all that said, I think it's finally time to start stretching our dough. And I found a few videos that I think are gonna be a pretty big help. So it seems like the process basically has 4 parts to it. First, pressing out the dough, then stretching it on the table, then picking it up and tossing it back and forth to both shake off the flour and continue stretching the dough, and then finally stretching it out the rest of the way. And with that last step, there seems to be a couple different techniques. But let's start from the beginning. So we definitely want to use plenty of flour.
Press down using 4 fingers.
And by the way, this is just a half-size pizza here for practice, so I'm only gonna stretch it out to about 11 inches total.
And this hand is more of a glider, and this hand is a puller. Keeping it close and tight, and be sure that you're stretching the crust and not the middle of the dough.
Not in the middle.
That's right.
Just at the edges.
So he said stretch the crust, but not the middle of the dough. Oh yeah. It's gonna take some practice, but we're getting there. Now we gotta shake off the flour. This part I am a little nervous about.
Then I start clicking it back and forth, knocking the flour off, and it's also opening it.
Lay it on this one and swipe it over there. You're gonna do this a couple of times.
Okay, so keep it moving. All right, not too bad. Wow. Yeah, that is a lot more uniform than what we were making before. I mean, I'm sure there was some beginner's luck involved there, but I did not think it was gonna go this well for my first attempt. I think this definitely helped. I'm using semolina flour, which is sort of like semolina, but a little bit finer. And I'm gonna use the same stuff to dust my pizza peel. You can see how easily that slides with the combination of the wood and the semolina flour.
Now, since we are trying to replicate a pizza shop here, I'm baking on the top rack of my oven. That way, the pizza will be as close to the top heating element as it would be in a commercial pizza oven. And that, in combination with the preheated baking steel, should hopefully help us to achieve the results that we're looking for.
All right, that's a pretty good looking pizza. I can already tell, like, even though I am getting some grease separation, it's more of an even distribution of grease since the dough itself is more even. Got some nice charring on the bottom. This is something that I had a hard time achieving with my other baking steel, and I definitely couldn't do it with the pizza stone. So this is a great pizza, but there's still something about it that's just not quite bringing me back to those original slices that I had at Joe's. It just doesn't have that same satisfying crispness to it, and the top crust just isn't quite caramelized enough. And I know I could bake a little bit longer, but that's just gonna bring us right back to the grease issue that we were seeing before. And in fact, I did give it a try, and that's exactly what happened. And the only other thing I can really think of that we're doing differently is the flour. Joe's, along with a lot of other New York pizza shops, use a high gluten flour called All Trumps. It has a protein content of 14.2% compared to the 12.7% in my King Arthur bread flour. The problem is that it only comes in these massive 25 or 50 pound bags, so it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for me to buy that much flour. Okay, fine. Let's do this.
So as I made my dough, I could immediately tell a difference. I made it using only high gluten flour, just like they do at Joe's, rather than a combination of bread flour and whole wheat flour with the bran sifted out, which is what I've been doing before based on what I learned from Scar's Pizza. So this dough is a lot softer and more extensible, which made it quite a bit easier to stretch and shape. And it also led to a subtle but noticeable improvement in texture when baked.
Look at that. That is a very solid slice. One thing I would say is the top is not quite as brown as I would like it.
I can tell it's definitely got more chew to it, and it's also quite a bit airier than my bread flour does. So this dough is definitely an improvement, and it does get us quite a bit closer to our authentic New York slice. But the crispiness is still lacking. And actually, after I bought this giant bag of All Trumps flour, I found out about one potential pretty big issue with it. So this flour has potassium bromate added, which improves the rise and elasticity of the dough and reduces mixing times. Which sounds great, but the problem is that bromate is known to be a carcinogen, and it's actually banned as a food additive in a lot of countries. And although the bromate should, in theory, be fully consumed during baking, I always like to use a more natural product whenever possible. Not to mention that this flour is also bleached to make it appear whiter, and it contains a bunch of other unnecessary ingredients as well. I mean, I don't even know what most of these are for. But in one of the videos I watched, I noticed
noticed that at Williamsburg Pizza, they use Caputo Americana flour, which has the same protein content as all Trumps, but it's unbromated and unbleached. And King Arthur makes a very similar flour as well, in which the only ingredient is wheat flour. So I was able to find both on Amazon, luckily in smaller packages this time, and they both worked out great. Now with all this said, bread flour is still easier to come by and a bit cheaper than this high gluten flour, so you can certainly still use it and achieve great results. But since we are going for a true New York slice in this series, I'm going to be using the high gluten flour from here on out. I may still include some portion of sifted whole wheat flour for a bit of extra flavor, but that's something I still need to figure out through some more testing. Like I said though, this dough still isn't perfect, but actually during my last bake, I noticed something very interesting about my oven, which made me realize that I might just be approaching this whole thing wrong. So since heat rises, I've always just assumed that my oven will be the hottest at the top, and so that's where I've been baking my pizza so far. I mean, after all, I'm trying to replicate a real pizza oven, and just visually that seems to be pretty close. But this isn't a pizza oven. It's a completely different size and shape, so I think I need to approach it differently. You see, like most ovens, it has both a top and a bottom heating element, but it actually seems like in my oven, most, if not all of the heat comes from this bottom element. So it's been on for about 5 minutes. Top is reading about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, where the bottom is reading about 560. So let me do some more testing. So I collected some data, testing both the ambient oven temperatures and the baking seal temperatures on each rack of my oven. And sure enough, I found that my oven actually gets the hottest on the bottom rack, with my baking steel getting a full 40 degrees hotter on the bottom rack than it does on the top. And when I baked a pizza using that rack, well, the results were interesting to say the least. All right, check this out. But I'm not mad about that. I mean, I've literally never achieved such a charred crust in a home oven. All we need to do now is just dial that back a little bit, and that's the easy part. And on top of that, it seems to have fixed a lot of the issues I was having with the browning on the crust. I'm not even really sure why it worked that way, but can't really complain too much. So we're definitely getting closer, and I think I have a couple ideas for how we can reduce this charring to the proper level. So after a lot more research and testing, I've come up with 2 best methods, which I'm gonna put head to head for one final test. The first is what I'm calling the Joe's method, because, well, it's about as similar as I could get to the actual method they use at Joe's. So looking back at our pizzamaking.com thread, Joe's bakes at a temperature of 625 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've got that part down, but here's what might solve our issue. Joe's also uses something called a pizza screen, which is basically just a vented aluminum sheet. And they're super cheap. I got this one at my local restaurant supply store for a whopping $3.75. But basically the idea is that you can bake the pizza on top of the screen to prevent direct contact with the baking surface, and therefore to prevent burning. But we don't want to prevent charring altogether. We just want to control it. So what they do at Joe's is insert the screen after about a minute or 2 of baking. That way they can still get that super hard char at the beginning, but they can also prevent the pizza from burning during the rest of the bake time. So for my take on the Joe's method, I preheat my oven to the highest temperature it'll go with my baking steel on the bottom rack. Then I bake the pizza directly on the steel for the first 2.5 minutes. Then I quickly slide the screen underneath and continue to bake for another 2.5 minutes. Now the second method is what I'm calling the home baker friendly method, because it doesn't require any additional equipment like a screen, and it doesn't require any tinkering during the baking process. So I found that if I want to bake directly on my baking steel without having to use a screen, my best bet is to bake on the second highest rack of my oven rather than on the bottom rack. And I also set my oven to 525 degrees Fahrenheit rather than 550, because I found that helps the top crust to get a little more evenly browned. So with this method, the pizza bakes in about 5 minutes total. And like I said, it doesn't require any maintenance during the baking process, but depending on how evenly your oven heats, you may want to rotate the pizza about halfway through to ensure even charring. Alright, so here's my Joe's pizza and here's my home baker version. Take a look at the crust. The Joe's method definitely led to some darker, sort of crispier bubbles, which I guess you'd expect based on the hotter steel temperature. Looking at the top crust though, it does look like the Joe's method led to a little bit more crispness there. Well, I'll first just say, I mean, these are both great pizzas. Definitely the best we've achieved so far. But if I did have to choose one, which I guess I do, I would go with the Joe's method. With our home baker dough, it did have that nice crispiness and charring to it, but the Joe's dough was even crispier and it had a lot nicer contrast on the crust. So you get these really dark charred bits from that super hot steel, but then since we move it to the screen, we can still maintain that sort of nice soft chewiness in between the charred bits. And with this one, it's just a little bit too hard all around, and it actually didn't seem to stay crispy for quite as long as the Joe's method. Again, still a great pizza, but this one's definitely the winner. So next week we're gonna tackle the sauce, which will finally be the last component of this pizza. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Now during this series, I was constantly learning, trying to improve my stretching, shaping, and baking techniques. And it took a lot of practice, but I did eventually get there, as you'll see toward the end of this video. But if you're on a similar journey, working to perfect your home pizza making, I don't want you to have to struggle the same way I did. Which is why I created my 120-minute pizza dough mastery workshop, which is designed to help you discover the dough handling secrets to make perfect pizza every single time. In the workshop, you'll follow along as we make, shape, and stretch pizza dough together, and we'll walk through everything you need to know to make sure your next pizza and your next is always better than the last. And I'm also including my ultimate pizza troubleshooting guide, which is a comprehensive guide on how to fix all the most common issues with pizza dough handling, absolutely free. And for viewers of this video, I'm offering an exclusive discount, so just enter the code NYPizza10 at checkout to get 10% off. Hope to see you over there.
So how do we make an authentic New York style pizza sauce? I thought that'd be an easy question to answer, but the more I looked into it, the more questions I had. And I actually found that almost every single New York style sauce recipe you'll see online isn't very authentic. And it's really for one main reason. To replicate that authentic New York pizza taste, we need to use canned tomatoes. But that's not the part that people get wrong. What most people don't realize is that the type of canned tomatoes you use is actually really important. You see, an authentic New York style pizza sauce is made using American grown tomatoes rather than the Italian grown tomatoes that are used in a Neapolitan pizza, which have a completely different flavor profile. But the main difference that we're worried about is that American grown tomatoes tend to be sweeter. And that sweetness is a defining characteristic of a New York style sauce, so it's very important that we get it right. I mean, some New York pizzerias even sweeten their sauce with extra sugar, but often the sweetness of the tomatoes alone will be enough. So after a lot of research online, trying to figure out which brands actual New York pizzerias use, I settled on 8 options, and I'm gonna do a blind taste test to figure out which is best. But actually, before we can do that properly, we need to answer one more very important question. To cook or not to cook? That's the question. Now, based on my research, the vast majority of New York pizza shops don't cook their sauce. And it makes sense because when you cook a sauce, you do bring out the sort of natural sweetness of the tomatoes, but you also take away some of their brightness and acidity. But there are some shops that cook their sauce, so it's definitely worth testing. And even though I haven't decided on a brand yet, it doesn't really matter because here we're just looking at the difference between a raw and a cooked sauce. So what I did was separate my puree into 2 separate containers, and with one, I simmered it over the stovetop for about 20 minutes. I found that any longer than that, and you lose out on too much acidity, and it starts to taste more like a pasta sauce than a pizza sauce. So over that 20 minutes, the sauce reduced by about 20%. So what I did with my other jar was just strain off a bit more liquid to make the consistencies the same between the two. And after letting the cooked sauce cool, it was time for the taste test. So I would say it's pretty much exactly what I expected. The cooked sauce definitely isn't quite as tangy and acidic, but it did maintain a pretty good amount of acidity, which I was kind of surprised about. The raw sauce was definitely more acidic though, and although it wasn't super sweet, I think by the time we add sugar to the actual pizza sauce, it's gonna taste pretty good. One thing I did notice though is the flavor of the cooked sauce seems to be a bit more concentrated. And I think that's because as we simmered the sauce down, we were evaporating off just the water, whereas when we strained out the raw sauce, that remaining liquid wasn't pure water, and so the resulting sauce isn't quite as concentrated. So based on this, I can't really say which one I like better. I mean, they both taste pretty solid. I think the only way to find out for sure is to bake some pizza with them. Now to make this a more true comparison, I also added a third variation here, which is the raw sauce with a bit of sugar added. I think that since the raw sauce isn't quite as sweet, you do need to add that sugar to get a true feel for what it should taste like. And again, the sauce is definitely a bit thicker than I would like it, but that's fine because we're just trying to compare the flavor here. All right, so in addition to the plain version, I also made one with cheese so I could get a true feel for what it's gonna taste like on the pizza. Cooked, raw sweetened. And that's the same on this side. All right, so to me, there's definitely a clear winner here. It's not the raw sauce. This one was just a little bit too one-dimensional. It had a nice tanginess to it, but there wasn't a lot of sweetness. So that one's out. Now it's between our cooked sauce and our sweetened raw sauce. So while they both do have a decent balance between the acidity and the sweetness, the raw sauce just definitely popped a lot more with that nice tanginess and acidity from the tomatoes. Again, even with this 20-minute simmer time, I think the cooked sauce just lost too much of that brightness and developed more of a pasta saucy flavor. And I mean, looking at them, you can tell a pretty big difference. The cooked sauce is a much deeper, darker red, where the uncooked sauce was a brighter, sort of pinker red, reminding me a lot more of the sauce at Joe's. And canned tomatoes are actually cooked a little bit during the canning process, so I think it actually takes away from the flavor if you cook them beyond that point. So again, for me, the choice is clear. From here on out, we're gonna go with the raw tomatoes. And of course, we'll be sure to add sugar as part of the sauce recipe to balance out those flavors. But before we can work on that sauce recipe, we need to decide on a brand of tomatoes. So let's get back to our taste test. And the brands I'll
I'll be testing are 7-Eleven, Tomato Magic, and Full Red, all of which are made by the same company, Stanislaus, and they're grown in California. And then we've also got Red Pack, which are grown in the Midwest. So these are all commercial grade products that only come in those big number 10 cans at food service stores, which means that they are what restaurants use, but they're not quite as accessible for the everyday consumer. So I'm also gonna compare with a few retail brands that pretty much everybody should be able to find. The first of those being Bianco di Napoli, which is actually what I noticed that Scar's Pizza uses. They're also grown in California, and they come in both whole tomato form and crushed, so I figured I'd try both. Then we've got Cento or Cento, whatever you call it, but these seem to be the most common brand that I see at grocery stores, even though they are grown in Italy. And then I also bought a generic grocery store brand for good measure. So all of the commercial grade tomatoes are either ground, crushed, or pureed, because your average New York slice joint isn't gonna take the time to process whole tomatoes themselves. But there are a few higher end places that do, so that's another reason I included the Bianco di Napoli and a couple of other whole peeled tomatoes to compare with. And of course I wanted to eliminate any potential bias, so I blended and strained each tomato until they were all the exact same consistency, and I also added labels to each bowl so that you can see which is which, but I can't. Now in hindsight, I definitely strained these a bit more than I would for an actual pizza sauce, but that's fine because we're just comparing the flavor here. I'm just gonna go ahead and put this one over here. So these two are definitely the worst. This one just doesn't have a lot of flavor. This one has sort of a weird bitterness to it. This one's very sweet, almost tastes like it has sugar added already. Not bad, but I think by the time that we were to cook it on a pizza, it'd be a little bit too sweet. This one again, kind of bitter and weak tasting. All right, so this one was definitely my favorite. It had a super bright, fresh taste to it with just the right amount of tanginess and a little bit of sweetness as well. These two though came in at a pretty close second. Honestly, I couldn't really distinguish between the two. Again, they had some pretty nice acidity, just not quite as much of that fresh tomato taste. And then this one would come in not too far behind these. Again, it had pretty much the same general flavor as these, but just not quite as potent. So let's see what we're working with. Number one, Red Pack. I'm actually kind of surprised about that. It comes in at a super good price, and it was actually the only one that had a pretty good consistency without even having to blend it at all. Now tied at second, we have the 7-Eleven and the Bianco di Napoli whole tomatoes. So again, the 7-Eleven was one that came in those number 10 cans, so they may not be available to everyone if you don't have a restaurant supply store near you, but these Bianco di Napoli tomatoes can be found at Whole Foods, and you can even buy them on Amazon. The disadvantage of these being they are a little bit more expensive, but in a way it's nice that they come in smaller cans so that you don't have to make giant batches of sauce and then freeze it or have it go to waste. So between these three, there should be at least one decent option that you can find in your area. And actually, after doing a bit more research, I found that Red Pack actually makes smaller cans that are a lot more affordable than the Bianco di Napoli tomatoes. And they're actually pretty readily available at a lot of grocery stores. So of course, I bought some to test, and while they're not exactly the same as the version that comes in the number 10 cans, they're close enough that I would still recommend them. Basically, the main difference is that the commercial Red Pack tomatoes are more concentrated and therefore a bit thicker than the retail version. And I also think that the commercial version tastes better, but it's probably not a big enough difference to outweigh the inconvenience of buying those big number 10 cans. All right, so here's our final lineup. Again, from best to worst. So even though we've only tasted the raw tomatoes, I feel confident enough in my three winners that we don't even need to bake a pizza with the rest. So with my three winners, I baked a pizza with each one just to make sure that they tasted just as good once they were baked. And again, I did a blind taste test just to eliminate any potential bias. All right, so between these bottom two here, I really can't tell any difference, but it doesn't matter because this one up here was the clear winner. I mean, don't get me wrong, they are all good, but this one just had a really nice brightness and acidity to it. And the acidity isn't something that you can modify by adding more salt or sugar. So to me, that is the most important trait when looking for a tomato for a pizza sauce. So let's see what it is. Yet again, it's the Red Pack, so I think we've got a pretty clear winner here. And not that it really matters because I couldn't tell the difference between the two, but this one's the 7-Eleven and this one's the Bianco di Napoli. So again, I don't think you could go wrong with either of these, but for me, I'm gonna be using the Red Pack from here on out. Now we have to figure out the proper consistency for our sauce. And this is something that we can get a pretty good idea of just by watching some videos of New York pizzerias in action. So I'm actually surprised to see that most places use a pretty thin sauce. By the looks of it, they probably don't strain their tomatoes at all. But during my testing so far, I have preferred a slightly thicker sauce because I found that a thinner sauce just tends to make the dough a little bit more soggy. But I still want to do an official test, so I baked 3 small pizzas, each with a different sauce consistency. And since the consistency of these Red Pack tomatoes is thicker than most other brands, I actually had to add some water to create my thin sauce. Then my thick sauce is just Red Pack tomatoes straight out of the can, and my extra thick sauce is strained off by about 15%. All right, so we've got the thin, thick, and then extra thick.
So surprisingly, even the thin sauce didn't really have a huge impact on the crispiness of the dough, but it did have a noticeably sort of wetter surface, which I wasn't really the biggest fan of. Also, the two thicker ones did have a noticeably more concentrated flavor, which was nice as well. I actually think this middle option struck the best balance between being nicely concentrated without being too dry. But I do think we need to test it on a full-size pizza before we can decide for sure. So I made two more sauces, one with red packed tomatoes diluted by about 15%, and the other with the red packed tomatoes straight out of the can. All right, so a couple takeaways here. Number one, to address the task at hand regarding the consistency, I think I do actually prefer the thicker sauce. Even though it doesn't seem quite as traditional based on what I'm seeing from New York pizza shops, it just doesn't really make sense to me to use a wetter sauce because it just makes the pizza a little bit soggier. But maybe I'm missing something, so if anybody does know the advantage of using a thinner sauce, let me know in the comments. So I definitely think thinning it out by 15% was too much. If anything, maybe I would try thinning it out by about 5 or 10%. But the other takeaway that I'm getting here, which is possibly even more important, is that I really don't think I like olive oil in the sauce. For my last few bakes before this test, I hadn't been using olive oil in the sauce, and I noticed that the pizza was a lot less greasy than it usually was. I think that with the full fat cheese, you really just don't need that extra fat from the olive oil. And honestly, I was trying to see if I could taste the olive oil, and I really couldn't taste it at all. And I think that getting rid of the olive oil would also allow me to use a little bit more cheese than I'm using here, because I don't have to worry as much about the greasiness of it. So we definitely got some important info here. But now it's time to dial in the rest of our sauce.
Now when it comes to ingredients, there are a few that are absolutely essential, a few that are sometimes added, and a few that are rarely added. Now I've already determined that I don't want to include olive oil, but I do think I want to include sugar, at least a little bit, because I think it's important in order to balance out the acidity. Then I'm also going to include oregano, because personally I think that's one of the flavors that kind of defines a New York style pizza. Then from there I'm also going to test garlic and basil, but I think that anything beyond that would just be too much. Ultimately, the tomatoes are the star of the show, so I don't want to drown them out with a bunch of other flavors, especially if those other flavors aren't considered essential. But of course we have to take it from the beginning, testing just one ingredient at a time.
So I'm starting off by making a very basic sauce consisting of red packed tomatoes diluted with water by about 7.5% plus some salt to taste, which in my case is about 2 grams of salt per 28 ounces of tomatoes. And here I'm using the big can red packed tomatoes because I didn't find out about the smaller cans until after I'd finished all of this testing. But since again those do have a thinner consistency, I found that I wouldn't need to dilute those at all. Instead, I just give them a blend to remove any big chunks and they're good to go.
Now I did also try using a food mill, but I found that it removed too much pulp from the sauce and sort of just left it thin and watery. So I actually much prefer the results from a blender. And I mean, if blending is good enough for Scar, then it's good enough for me. And if you're worried about the sauce turning orange from aeration, just let the blended sauce rest in the fridge overnight and it'll get back to its original color. Or you can just use crushed tomatoes straight out of the can, which is what a lot of New York pizzerias do anyways. But for me, I do prefer the slightly smoother texture that you get from blending. Anyways, for each test, I made 3 pizzas.
One with a large amount of the ingredient in question, one with a moderate amount, and one with little to none. So after each round, as I decide on the winner, I'm gonna add the corresponding amount of that ingredient to my mother sauce here. So we'll sort of be building our sauce as we go along.
And the first ingredient we're gonna test is the sugar.
So we got low sugar, medium sugar, and then high sugar. And the high sugar is exactly what Joe's uses. All right, so I definitely do think you need a good amount of sugar to balance out the acidity of tomatoes, but the Joe's sauce is a little bit too sweet for my taste. This one though might not be sweet enough. So I think ultimately we're gonna end up somewhere in between these two. So I would put us somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7 grams of sugar per ounce of sauce. Up top, we got the low oregano. Down here, mid oregano. Over here, high oregano. All right, so this first one, I can barely taste the oregano, if at all. And when I tasted the second one, I thought that would be the perfect amount. I could taste it just a little bit, but it wasn't overpowering. But then I tried the third pizza, and it actually wasn't too bad either. I would say it's a little bit too much oregano, but not by a huge margin. So I think what I'm gonna go with is somewhere right between these two, which will end up being about 3 teaspoons of oregano per 28 ounces of tomatoes. Again, this isn't my final decision. I'll still have to see how it interacts with the rest of the ingredients, but for now, that's what I'm gonna go with. This is my baseline. This is no garlic. This is about 1 clove per 28 ounces of tomatoes, and this is about 2 cloves per 28 ounces. All right, so this is a pretty tough one actually. What I basically found is that even a pretty small amount of garlic pretty significantly changes the flavor profile of the sauce. And I can't quite decide whether or not that's a good thing. For me though, I do want it to be a pretty tomato forward sauce, but I also kind of like the additional element that that garlic adds. So I think what I'm gonna do is go with just a little bit of garlic, probably about a half a teaspoon per 28 ounces of tomatoes. That way it will barely be detectable on its own, but it'll still add a nice little extra dimension to the sauce. So you can't really taste the basil itself that much in the same way that you taste the oregano, for example, but you kind of get more of just like an essence or the aroma of the basil, which I do think is actually pretty nice. It kind of reminded me more of like a Neapolitan style pizza, which after all is what the New York style evolved from. So I do think it's worth adding. So I think what I'm gonna start with is exactly what I used on this pizza, which is about a half a leaf of basil per ounce of tomatoes. So for a full 28-ounce batch, that'll be 14 basil leaves. But to be sure that the sauce is actually as good and as authentic as I want it to be, I have to perform one final test. All right, so for my final test here, I've got the sauce that we developed in this episode with the red pack tomatoes, and then I made the same sauce with the 7-Eleven tomatoes just to make sure that I do still like the red pack the best. And then this third option here is a more basic sauce, again using red pack tomatoes, but it only includes salt, sugar, and a little bit of oregano. But I actually do have one more to compare with. So I actually made it back to Joe's yesterday, and this time I brought myself home a few slices so that I had a reference point to compare my own pizza to. So as we know, Joe's uses a very basic sauce, just the tomatoes, salt, and sugar. I mean, it pretty much tastes like they use the tomatoes straight out of the can, definitely not cooked, and it's actually not quite as sweet as it was the last time. There might just be variations from batch to batch, but I do like it a little bit less sweet, so I may end up bumping down the sugar content in my own recipe as well. But let's give mine a taste. Starting with that basic recipe, because that's gonna be the most similar to Joe's. So the Joe's sauce is definitely good, but tasting them side by side, I do think I prefer mine. I mean, I think the oregano adds a great flavor, and with the red pack tomatoes, it's got a lot more tanginess to it. Like I said, the Joe's sauce just tastes like tomatoes straight out of the can, and the tomatoes that they use don't seem to be quite as acidic. But this is still my basic version, so let me try the others and see if I do still like them better. All right, so regarding the tomatoes, I do still like the red pack ones the best, but the 7-Eleven aren't really too far behind. So I'd say that if you can find red pack, you should get them, but I think that any of the top brands that we've talked about are gonna be fine. Now, as far as the ingredients, that one is a little bit trickier because even this basic sauce is really good. For me though, I do think I like the addition of the basil and garlic, but only in very small amounts. Here, the garlic is still actually a little bit too strong, even though I only used a half a teaspoon for an entire 28-ounce can of tomatoes. But this still begs the question, which sauce is more authentic? Well, that's what I still need to figure out. But in order to do that, I think I need to make a trip to refresh my memory on some New York pizza spots. I traveled all the way to New York to eat at some of the city's best pizzerias with the goal of answering one simple question: what actually defines a great New York slice? Now, if you've been following this series, you know that we've already gotten pretty close in replicating the style of pizza at home. But I'm not aiming for pretty close. I want to make a great slice, one that rivals some of the top spots in the city, and I want to create a foolproof method that anyone can follow to do the same. But in order to do that, I need to try some of these spots for myself. But I've only got one day to hit all 9 of these spots, so we better get started.
Pizza time.
All right, first slice of the day here, Bleecker Street Pizza. Let's give it a try. A lot of cheese on this one, pretty good charring on the bottom. Not a super dark crust on the top though, so let's see what it tastes like. Forgot to hit record at first, hopefully I at least got some decent footage. But again, my main takeaway, nothing really too special. Crust doesn't have a lot of flavor. Not super crispy, I mean there's nothing really that sets it apart. So I'll take down a couple notes here and then we'll head to the next place.
When I get in, I take a shower, read a book and feel empowered.
All right, so this is Two Bros. Honestly, this one kind of looks better to me than Bleecker Street. It's got some nice browning on the cheese, not too much cheese, but then when I flipped it over, there's absolutely no browning on the bottom of the crust. So for me, it's not looking too good. Flavor-wise, it's really not bad. I mean, my biggest problem with it is that the sauce is really sweet. It does seem to have some oregano in there. Obviously, the other problem is just that the crust is so soft. There's absolutely no crispness to it whatsoever. Kind of just tastes like a generic, cheap Little Caesars or Chuck E. Cheese type pizza. I mean, it's $1, so you can't really expect too much, but I think it's time to head to the next place. So not a great start. The cheese fell off the slice immediately, but let's see how it tastes. Flavor-wise, it's not too bad. I do think it has a little bit too much cheese for my taste. Could use a little bit more charring on the bottom. Otherwise, the sauce definitely has some oregano in it, although I don't think it has much of anything else. I'd say the actual dough recipe is the best of any I've seen yet. I just would have preferred a little bit more crispiness. But now it's time to hit the one I've been waiting for this whole series. Let's head over to Scars. This looks like by far the best one yet. It's got a really nice thickness to it, nice crispiness, good amount of cheese, good amount of sauce. It smells really good, so curious to give it a try. I had super high expectations after all this build up, but that is a really, really good slice. Possibly the best slice I've ever had. Again, the crust is perfect. perfect. The sauce is nice and tangy with a little bit of sweetness, not too much spice. I did see them using some oregano, but I don't think there's anything else other than the oregano. And the cheese, there's something about it as well. It's got a slightly different flavor than most other New York pizzas. I have to do a little bit more research, see if I can gain any more insight, but otherwise, really good. So visually, very similar to Scars actually. The only difference I really noticed right off the bat is here they grate a little bit of Parmigiano over top, and of course they also add some basil here. Pretty dark crust, very good structure. Let's give it a try. Yeah, that's another really, really good slice. It is pretty similar to Scars. It seemed like Scars cheese had a little bit of a different flavor. Maybe they used a little bit, what's that shit? Maybe they use a little bit of provolone at Scars, but the sauce is very similar. It's got a really nice tang to it, a little bit of sweetness. Great sauce to cheese ratio, really well seasoned, nice airy crust. Honestly, there's not much you can really improve about this slice. I do like the addition of the basil. I don't know if it's classic or traditional based on some of the other places I've tried, but we'll just see how it goes the rest of the time. Honestly, this one and Scars are the most similar to the slices that I've been making, so I think I'm definitely on the right track with mine. Based on this, I'm leaning more towards my basic sauce, maybe with the addition of basil, but I really don't think I should be adding the garlic. I haven't detected any garlic in any of the pizzas I've tried so far. Anyways, let's keep it moving. All right, this one's best pizza. It had been sitting there for a while, it looked like, so it's not super fresh, but otherwise it looks pretty good, so let's see how it tastes. They do use fresh mozzarella, so you can definitely tell looking at it. Looks a little different than the rest, but I still wanted to give it a try because I've heard good things about it. Again, really good structure, nice crust, on par with Scars and L'Industrie. So this is another really good slice. First thing I noticed though, I'm not the biggest fan of the fresh mozzarella when it's on the pizza like this. It kind of has a weird soft, mushy texture to it. Crust is really good though. Not baked too dark, not too crunchy, but not too chewy. Honestly, pretty much spot on. It's got a nice flavor as well. And again, the sauce, really nice too. Not quite as tangy maybe as L'Industrie and Scars, but pretty good. Definitely a little bit more heavily topped than the others. That's the first thing I noticed. It's got a nice crisp crust, pretty decent structure though otherwise. This has a lot of sauce on it. It is a really good sauce though, lots of oregano. Cheese seems to be really high quality. Pretty sure they just use grande whole milk. But anyways, another great slice. Don't think it's quite as good as the last few, but definitely very solid. This slice is pretty similar to the last few, and honestly it's getting a little bit harder to discern each one. The point here is not to compare them, just to get a feel for what they're like. And this one's definitely up there with Scars and L'Industrie as my favorites. The dough's got a really solid structure, that nice crispiness, great cheese to sauce ratio, really basic but delicious sauce with that little bit of tanginess. And honestly, my only complaint would be that the dough could use maybe a little bit more flavor. But overall, very solid slice. So this is the last slice of the day, New Park Pizza in Queens. First thing I noticed, it has a very floppy structure. They also use fresh mozzarella, so that's a little bit different than most. So it is a little bit too floppy for my taste. I prefer a bit more structure. But flavor-wise, it is a really good slice. I mean, again, a very basic sauce. I don't even think they put oregano in this one, so it's basically just tomatoes and salt. Maybe a little bit of sugar, but it's hard to tell. So despite how it looks when you pick it up, there's really no crunch to the crust. The charring does add a bit of flavor, but that's about it. So after all this, I definitely have a much better idea of what's authentic. So let's head back and dial in this final recipe. I'll see you there.
So I learned a lot on this trip and throughout the series in general really, more than I have time to talk about in these videos. So I actually decided to start a free newsletter that you can check out right here. But basically I'll be sending out additional insights about pizza making and other food related topics that I don't have time to cover in these videos. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to check out the link in the description below. Alright, now one thing I do know after this trip is that I'm good on the cheese. The most traditional taste definitely comes from a low moisture mozzarella, along with the addition of some Parmigiano or Pecorino on top of the sauce. And I talked all about that in the cheese episode of this series, so I'd recommend checking that one out if you haven't seen it yet. And as far as the sauce, I think I'm also good there. That is using my basic recipe, which is an uncooked sauce consisting of just tomatoes, salt, sugar, and oregano. And since the sauce is so simple, the tomatoes you use become even more important. And for me, I'm still really happy with Red Pack. They have that nice tang that I recognize from my favorite spots in the city like Scars and Lindustry, which the other brands and the other more mediocre slices I tried just sort of lacked. Now 7-Eleven and Bianco di Napoli, which is actually what both Scars and Lindustry use, are both great as well. Honestly, I'm not sure whether I like those or Red Pack better. I would just recommend trying whatever you have available to you and see what you like best. So I think overall we're very close, but we're not all the way there. And if you've watched the series up until this point, you know that by far the most elusive part of this pizza is the dough. But after this trip, I think I finally have all of the pieces I need in order to perfect it. So my top 3 pizzerias in terms of dough structure were Lindustry, Scars, and Joe's. But with that said, there are a couple areas that I think my dough is still lacking in. The first being the chew factor. Even using a high gluten flour, I'm struggling to achieve enough chew in my crust as I should be. So to address that, I actually decided to remove olive oil from the dough. You see, oil inhibits gluten development. So even though some pizzerias do include it, I think they can get away with it because they're making their dough in such large batches and they're using heavy-duty commercial mixers. So for us who are making small batches of dough by hand, removing oil from the dough helps us to get that much nicer chew that we're looking for. Now the other main thing I noticed is that compared to some of the top pizzerias I tried, my dough was noticeably lacking in flavor. When I compare to Scars and Lindustry though, their flavor is a lot more interesting, bready, and complex. And honestly, mine is just sort of bland by comparison. And there are 2 main things that I could think of that might help with that. The first would be to use a pre-ferment like a Biga or a Poolish, which I actually found out on my trip that Lindustry does. And I actually tried it too in the very first episode of the series, but I thought that it gave the dough a little bit too much of a fermenty flavor for a New York style pizza. But Scars doesn't use a pre-ferment, and their dough still tastes great. What they do though that I haven't been doing is use fresh yeast. Now this stuff can be pretty hard to find. It took me about a dozen grocery store trips before I finally found some. And there are mixed opinions about whether or not it'll even make a difference, but most New York pizzerias do seem to use it, so there may be something to that. So let's see what we're working with here. Fresh yeast compared to the instant dry yeast that I've been using. So the fresh yeast definitely has a much stronger yeasty, sort of funky smell to it. It may just be because it's already hydrated though. So what I want to know is if it's still noticeable once it's mixed into the dough. It's just barely noticeable once it's mixed into the dough. But what I really want to know is if it's still noticeable once the pizza is baked. It's not still noticeable once the pizza is baked, at least to me, and I mean that's kind of what I expected from the beginning. In theory they're the exact same stuff, one is just pre-hydrated and one isn't. I think that the actual fermentation process you use is a lot more important, because as dough ferments, the sugars and proteins in the wheat break down into more complex alcohols, acids, and other flavorful compounds. So a longer fermentation means more flavor, but it also means a weaker dough structure because of that breakdown. So I've been playing around with longer fermentation times in the fridge, and I found about 2 to 3 days to be the sweet spot. I think the dough develops plenty of flavor that way without the need for a pre-ferment. But another thing that really stood out to me about Lindustry was just how airy their dough was. That was probably my favorite thing about it, even though that's not always characteristic of a New York style pizza. And it's not just about texture. More air in the dough actually means more flavor. I mean, air is the whole reason that bread tastes so good. Those aromatic flavor compounds get trapped within the bubbles in the bread, only to be released when you bite into it. So aside from using a longer fermentation period, another thing that Lindustry does to create an airier dough is to use a higher hydration than most other pizzerias. And I know, I made a whole episode about how using a lower hydration is better, and so far it has been. I think the main reason Lindustry can get away with it is because they use such a high temperature oven. But I've made a lot of changes to this dough since the beginning of the series, so I wanted to give the hydration one more try. Now, I was still playing around with fermentation times here, and so my doughs were definitely overproofed, and therefore the pizzas ended up flatter than I would have liked. But that's okay, because the main goal here was just to test the hydration levels. So here I've got 3 pizzas, same exact recipe and process. This one's 55% hydration, this one's 60%, and this one's 65%. What I'm also gonna do is reheat the slices. So usually when you go to a slice shop, you'll get a slice from a pizza that was baked anywhere between about 10 to 30 minutes ago. So before they give it to you, they'll throw it back in the oven for a couple minutes to reheat it, which of course will have an impact on the texture of the pizza, so I had to give it a try. So after my usual baking process, I just let the pizza cool for 10 to 15 minutes with my oven still running at its highest temp. Then I toss the slices back onto my pizza steel, which I have sat on my oven's second highest rack, for about 2 minutes or until they were charred to my liking. All right, time for the moment of truth. Wow, I think we finally did it. I kind of feel stupid for not thinking about it earlier, but the reheat makes all the difference. With that said, I think any of these 3 hydrations could work. It really just depends on what your preferences are. So if you don't want to mess with a reheat, I would say the only one that was acceptable to eat after the first bake was this 55%. That lower hydration allows it to crisp up with just a single bake, so I would say around 55 to 57 is the sweet spot if you don't want to reheat. If you don't mind reheating though, and you want the absolute best results, I would go for 60% or higher. The reason being, with higher hydration doughs, you can develop gluten a lot easier, and so these were noticeably chewier than the 55%. The problem was that they didn't quite crisp up enough after the first bake, but by the time you reheat them, you kind of get the best of both worlds, both with the chewiness and the crispiness. So I would say 60% is kind of more like a classic New York slice that isn't too airy, whereas 65% or higher gives you a little bit of an airier dough, more like L'Industrie or Scars. And for me, I really like that, so I think I'm actually going to experiment a little bit more with fermentation times and hydration levels, and I'll discuss the results in the next episode, which by the way will finally be the step-by-step guide for how to make this pizza. So you can watch that video right here once it's uploaded, but in the meantime, if you haven't seen the first few episodes of the series, you can check those out right here. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Now, in large part due to what I learned during this series, I recently started my own pizza pop-up, and it's been pretty amazing to me just how quickly I can learn and improve when I'm making dough in such large quantities. I feel like my skills have improved tenfold since this series, and I want to help you to have that same transformation, which is why I recently created my 120-minute workshop, Pizza Dough Mastery. In short, the workshop is designed to help you discover the dough handling secrets to make perfect pizza every single time. In the workshop, you'll follow along as we make, shape, and stretch pizza dough together, and we'll walk through everything you need to know to make sure that your next pizza and your next is always better than the last. And this workshop has already been transformative for a lot of home pizza makers. Just take a look at some of the results that students have already achieved. So if you want to get in on the workshop, I'm offering an exclusive discount for viewers of this video. Just enter the code NYPizza10 at checkout to get 10% off. I hope to see you over there. But now, let's get back to the video. I spent the past 6 months creating the perfect New York style pizza recipe. I mean, I studied this pizza harder than most people study for finals. And after countless hours and what feels like hundreds of tests, I can confidently say this is the most authentic New York style pizza recipe designed for home cooks. I mean, probably. And by the end of this video, you'll know how to make it. And it all starts with the crust, which to me is defined by 4 main things: thinness, chew, crispness, and charring. So nearly every single pizzeria in New York is gonna be using high gluten flour. This is what gives the pizza its signature chew, so you're really just not gonna achieve the right results without it. So personally, I use King Arthur high gluten flour. It's easy to find online, at least if you're in the US, although it is a bit more expensive than your typical flour. So another alternative would be to use normal bread flour and then add some vital wheat gluten to increase the protein content. Now, some of the best pizzerias I tried in New York also include a small amount of sifted, freshly milled flour for extra flavor, somewhere around 10% of the total flour. So if you don't have access to freshly milled flour, the best alternative would be to use either spelt or rye flour. And again, you should sift it to remove the excess bran, because that bran would otherwise inhibit gluten development and reduce the chewiness of the final crust. Personally, I like to sift a big batch ahead of time and keep it in my cabinet for easy access. And by the way, you can find the complete recipe in the description below, but to make it more customizable, I also made up a dough calculator spreadsheet. Basically, you can enter the size pizza you want to make, how many you want to make, and a few other things we'll discuss later, and it'll calculate a recipe for you. And there's also an area where you can figure out how much vital wheat gluten you need to add to your flour if that's the route you're taking. So the spreadsheet is free to use, you can check it out in the description below. But anyways, now that the flour is taken care of, let's talk water, aka hydration. Basically, the higher the hydration, the airier your crust will be, but also the less crispy and structured it'll be. So I found that a 65% hydration, or 65 grams of water per 100 grams of flour, is the perfect middle ground. It's low enough that the dough doesn't become sticky and hard to work with, but high enough that the final crust ends up both airy and crisp. But since everyone has different preferences, I've listed a few different dough styles on the spreadsheet, and based on which one you choose, the hydration level will be adjusted accordingly. But anyways, after mixing the flour and water, we're gonna let the dough rest, aka autolyse, for about 20 minutes. This lets the flour hydrate and start forming gluten before we add any other ingredients. And before you think, psh, I can just skip that step, let me show you the difference it makes. Here you can see the dough before the autolyse versus after, and whenever I made the dough without this step, it turned out significantly less chewy. But after the dough rests, we can add the dry ingredients, starting with the yeast. I use a relatively small amount, just about 0.5% as a baker's percentage, which I explain in episode 2 of this series, but that basically just means 0.5 grams of yeast for every 100 grams of flour. And the reason I use so little is because this allows the dough to rise slower and therefore to develop more flavor as it ferments. But now I'll add my salt in a baker's percentage of 3% and my sugar in a baker's percentage of 1.5%. The sugar is going to help the crust to brown more quickly, which is especially helpful in a home oven that doesn't get as hot as a commercial pizza oven does. Now, after giving everything a mix and a few kneads on my table, I'll let the dough rest again for about 20 more minutes. This is going to let the gluten relax, which in turn will make the dough much easier to knead. And when we come back, we'll just knead for about 5 minutes. If the dough gets too sticky at any point, let it rest for about a minute or two, and by the time you come back, it'll be much easier to work with. Now, after kneading, I'll let the dough rest for a few more minutes before forming it into a nice taut ball, and then throwing it back into my covered bowl to rise. We're looking for
it to double or triple in size here, which should take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours depending on the temperature of your environment. Then from there, we'll divide the dough into the desired number of pieces. In my case here, I'm making 2 14-inch pizzas. And of course, you should weigh out the pieces to make sure they're exactly the right size. Then form each one into a very top ball. And this is important because this is what will keep the dough strong as it rises and allow it to stay circular when we eventually form it out into a pizza. Then from here, we'll just put them into containers to rise. So I usually use either these metal cake pans or these bowl plate thingies I have, but just use whatever you have. A 9x13 pan or even a normal plate works fine. You just don't want to use a container that's too narrow because that'll mess up the shape of the dough that we work so hard to create. But next, we'll throw them into the fridge to ferment for another 2 to 3 days. Technically, you could use this dough the same day, but the longer you let it ferment, the more flavorful it'll be. After too long though, the dough becomes weak and deflated, so I found about 2 to 3 days to be the sweet spot. Now in the meantime, let's talk sauce. And the most important consideration here is which brand of tomatoes you use. So canned tomatoes are a given for New York style pizza, but not all brands have the right flavor profile. The best I've found are these Red Pack crushed tomatoes. However, this version only comes in these massive number 10 cans, which is a lot of tomatoes. Perfect for those quiet nights at home when you want to bake 20 to 30 pizzas, but for the average day, not so much. Of course, you can freeze the sauce, but that's still a lot to keep in your freezer. Now Red Pack also makes a retail 28-ounce can, but they're not nearly as good. The best retail brand I found is these Cento all-in-ones. Not the normal crushed Centos. They have to be the all-in-ones. So you can buy them online from Cento, but with shipping they're pretty expensive. So I actually buy mine from a site called Imperfect Foods. This isn't sponsored though, that's just genuinely where I buy most of my produce from. I do have a discount link in the description below though if you're interested in signing up. Otherwise, Bianco di Napoli whole peeled tomatoes are also pretty good, and they're readily available at Whole Foods and on Amazon. But now for the recipe itself, New York style sauce is very basic. It's not cooked, and the only ingredients are tomatoes, salt, oregano, and sometimes sugar. The last of which I do personally like to add because it helps balance out the acidity of the tomatoes. But the other main thing to consider is the sauce consistency. The commercial red packs are a bit too thick straight out of the can, so what I do is dilute them by about 25%. That's 26 ounces of water per number 10 can. But when I'm using any other brand, I don't dilute them. What I do though, regardless of the brand, is blend the tomatoes. I found that milling removes too much of the tomato pulp, and leaving the sauce unprocessed leaves me with too many big chunks of tomatoes. And if you use an immersion blender, you can make the sauce straight inside a container for easy storage in the fridge. But now with our sauce and dough prepared, let's talk baking. A typical New York pizzeria is going to be baking at a minimum of 550 degrees Fahrenheit or 287.77777 degrees Celsius. But the best spots I visited bake even higher, usually between 620 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit. So this means at home we should bake at our oven's highest possible temperature, which is typically going to be 550 degrees Fahrenheit. But since that's still lower than we would ideally want, we need to make one more adjustment, and that is to bake on steel rather than stone. Steel retains heat better than stone, and it also transfers heat much more quickly, which is going to help to crisp up the bottom of the pizza. So the brand I use is Baking Steel, and this one in particular is the Baking Steel Pro. It's great because it's 3/8 of an inch thick, so it retains plenty of heat, and it's also 16 inches by 16 inches, which means that I can bake a 16-inch pizza, which I think is important given that one of the defining characteristics of a New York style pizza is its size. So again, this isn't sponsored, it's just a product that I genuinely use and enjoy. But I was able to get a discount code for anyone watching my videos. So if you use the code Charlie10 at checkout, you can get 10% off your order. I'll leave that link in the description below. But anyways, when I'm getting ready to bake, I'll place my steel onto the second highest rack of my oven. Then I'll set the oven to 550 degrees Fahrenheit and let it preheat for at least an hour, but preferably up to 90 minutes. And at the same time, I'll take my dough out of the fridge to let it come up to room temperature and to rise just a bit more. Then once the oven is preheated, we can shape and top the pizza. So here we'll be making a classic cheese slice. And when it comes to cheese, there's really only one obvious choice: low moisture mozzarella. Preferably whole milk low moisture mozzarella because it's gonna have a much better flavor and texture than the part skim stuff. Unfortunately though, it's not too easy to find whole milk low moisture mozzarella, let alone a high quality one. The gold standard for New York pizzerias though is a brand called Grande. It's only available at food service stores, but if you can find some of it, you should use it. What really separates the good cheese from the bad is the meltability. It should melt super nicely without separating too much, and it should stay rich and gooey on top of the pizza. Now since mozzarella is pretty mild tasting, it's also traditional to add some grated pecorino romano for extra saltiness and tang. But now when we're ready to bake, I'll start by getting everything lined up. My dough, sauce, pecorino, and mozzarella. And then I've also got my wooden pizza peel, which I'm going to use to slide the pizza off into the oven. And I've got my 2 flour shakers for dusting, one all-purpose and one semola. So I'll start by sprinkling some of the semola flour onto my pizza peel and onto my work surface. Then I'll dust the dough with a generous amount of all-purpose flour, bring it out onto my surface, and then dust it again with the all-purpose flour. Now working from the center outward, press the dough down, being sure to leave a thicker portion at the edge to form the crust. Then spread it out on the counter like so, trying to keep it as round as possible. And this is where all of that flour that we added to the surface comes in handy. And from here on, you want to avoid stretching out the middle any further, so be sure to only stretch around the edges. Next, toss the dough back and forth from arm to both knock off the flour and to continue stretching it out. Then finally continue stretching it with your fists like so, rotating and stretching until the dough reaches the proper size. You want to keep the dough moving as quickly as possible to prevent any uneven spots, which will take some practice, and I'm still not an expert by any means, but you'll get better as you do it more. Then just place the dough out onto your peel, and if it's still not big enough, continue stretching until it is. So we'll start with our sauce, pouring in the center and then swirling outward to create an even distribution. Then hit it with optionally a bit more oregano, then pecorino, and then mozzarella. And you want to avoid adding too much sauce or cheese in the center because that can lead to a soggy pizza. Now the amounts of each ingredient you use will depend on what size pizza you're making and on your preferences. So on the spreadsheet there are several options to choose from. Here I'm making a 16-inch pizza with medium sauce and medium cheese, although I usually prefer to make the version with light cheese. And I think it goes without saying that you can add whatever toppings you like at this point too. Now I'll just give the dough a little shimmy to make sure it's not going to stick when I slide it off, which the wooden pizza peel really helps to prevent, but if you have a baking tray big enough or even just a piece of cardboard, you can use that instead. Now I'll carefully slide this pizza off onto my hot steel and bake it for about 4 to 5 minutes. And I like to rotate the pizza halfway through to make sure it browns evenly. You'll know it's ready to take out when the cheese is nicely melted together and has just started to separate. But we're not done yet, because if you've ever gotten pizza by the slice, you know that it's generally reheated to order, meaning that it was baked and then cooled and then heated again before serving, which has a big impact on the crust. Specifically, it helps us to get that solid crispness and structure that we're looking for. So after letting the pizza cool for 15 to 20 minutes, I'll cut a slice and then throw it back onto my steel with the oven still set to 550 degrees. And I also like to turn on the broiler to get the top of the slice nice and browned as well. And after about 60 to 90 seconds, when the slice is charred to my liking, it's ready to serve.
And that, my friends, is an authentic New York slice at home. It's got the perfect chew, perfect crunch, nice charring on the bottom. The sauce is tangy but also sweet. Really, this is my ideal New York slice. And remember, to take your pizza dough handling skills to the next level, be sure to check out my Pizza Dough Mastery Workshop. You can find the link below. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.